Well, thank you. It is a pleasure to be here. And a huge thank you to the New York Academy of Sciences and the Newer Foundation for making this series possible. This whole series on the unconscious has been really exciting for me because it raises all kinds of questions that I think about all the time, like where do our dreams come from? And what about creativity? Is this something the science of neural correlates and brain chemistry will ever explain? And what should we make of those experiences that I would call transcendent, when the world suddenly opens up and seems to be full of meaning? Now, those are questions that lurk on the edges between our rational scientific understanding of the world and what may be a different way of knowing, more intuitive, less analytical, perhaps more deeply felt. And then on top of that, you have the great theorists of the unconscious, Freud and Jung, with their complicated history together before they split and went their separate ways. So we have a great evening ahead of us. And not only do we have a leading Freudian scholar and a leading scholar of Jung, we also have a remarkable novelist who's carved out a second career writing about science and psychology and the mind. So let me introduce our speakers. Siri Hustvedt, PhD, is lecturer in psychiatry at the Weill Medical School of Cornell University. She's a novelist and essayist whose works repeatedly pose questions about the nature of identity, selfhood, and perception. She's also published papers in academic and scientific journals. Her novels include What I Loved and The Summer Without Men, and her nonfiction includes The Shaking Woman, or A History of My Nerves, and her new collection of essays, A Woman Looking at Men, Looking at Women. Sonu Shamdasani, PhD, is a London-based author, editor, and professor at the Wellcome Trust Center for the History of Medicine at University College London. He's director of the Center for the History of Psychological Disciplines. His writings focus on Carl Jung and cover the history of psychiatry and psychology from the mid-19th century to current times. He edited one of Jung's major works, the Red Book, and he's the co-founder of the Philemon Foundation, which aims to publish all of Jung's writings. Mark Solms, PhD, is a psychoanalyst. He holds the chair of neuropsychology at the University of Cape Town and is the president of the South African Psychoanalytical Association. He founded the International Neuropsychoanalysis Society and was a founding editor of the journal Neuropsychoanalysis. He's best known for his discovery of the forebrain mechanisms of dreaming and his pioneering use of psychoanalytic methods and theories in contemporary neuroscience. He's the editor of the revised standard edition of the Complete Psychological Works of Sigmund Freud, which runs to 24 volumes. Welcome, all of you. So I think it would be useful to start out by defining some of our terms. And Mark, I'm going to start with you. What exactly do we mean when we use that word, the unconscious?
Well, you can obviously state it simply and say, not conscious. And then it splits into the sort of medical meaning of unconscious as in coma or stupor. And then the psychological meaning, which becomes, I think that's exactly our topic. You're going to have great difficulty getting any agreement on it. But I think that the important thing in terms of the psychoanalytical tradition is that the unconscious mind is just that. It's a mind. It's not just something automatic, something out of consciousness, something that reflexively happens. It's an intentional agent that's part of you, that's making decisions, driving your volitional activities without your awareness. And most importantly, which is, I think, uniquely psychoanalytical, is that it resists self-knowledge. So it's not just that it's outside of awareness, but that it doesn't want to be to become aware. So I think those would be some of the sort of central features of how at least within my broad discipline, we would think about the unconscious.
Now, I know people have been talking about the unconscious for decades, probably for more than that. And Siri, I know you've looked into some of the history of how people try to frame this.
I think it's interesting because now no one disputes that there is an unconscious. There's now something called the cognitive unconscious or the adaptive unconscious. But when behaviorism was reigning, they really did not want to talk about the unconscious. It made them think of Freud, and they were very much anti-Freud. But these conflicts go on. It's a very old idea. Some people go all the way back to Ptolemy, who talked about, he didn't use, obviously, that we're way back now, but that in vision there were unconscious processes. And well before Freud, well before Jung, even Descartes in Passions of the Soul talks about the fact that a man could have had a childhood experience that he does not remember and that nevertheless affects him. So there it is in Descartes. None of us, I think, here are Cartesians. Leibniz talked about unconscious perceptions, perceptions that were so small that, they weren't perceived. And then, again, in the 19th century, there were two English guys, one that I like quite a lot, William Benjamin Carpenter, who talked about unconscious processes, and the philosopher Sir William Hamilton. All were talking about the unconscious. Now, there are wrinkles in the different ideas, but I think it's important to keep this in mind. It was not invented a few decades ago.
So, Sonu, is there a clear dividing line between the conscious and the unconscious?
Well, depends according to who.
Yes.
So,
this is it. Yeah.
Siri sort of really clearly put out, there are different models of the unconscious, but I don't think people are necessarily talking about the same thing.
Right.
And this is the first problem we come into. And there are many people around the globe, billions, who would not say that they have an unconscious. They've got alternate modes of understandings. They have different ontologies, which for them perfectly suffice.
Why would they resist that notion of the unconscious?
They've got notions that they have that they consider perfectly adequate. You go to India and people talk about karma. They talk about the Dharma.
Yeah.
They have different modes of self-understanding, different models of health and of healing. And I think one of the issues which will presumably be explored tonight is the fact that in today's society, when people use the word unconscious, they often mean different things by it.
Yes.
Because as Siri is pointing out, there's a philosophical background, there's also a biological background, a physiological background, and a psychological background. And these usages get mixed up. So it's a term that becomes sort of ripe for confusion.
And one of the big questions, which we're obviously going to be exploring tonight, is how much can we ever know the unconscious? I mean, almost by definition, to some degree,
Yes.
we can't know it, right? And we can only get glimpses of it. Mark?
No, that's right, and I think that there the psychoanalytical and the cognitive neuroscience traditions converge. As I think Siri said, it's now common cause that not only that there is an unconscious mental life, but that the bulk of what we consider mental activity occurs outside of awareness. In cognitive neuroscience, it's more a matter of it being not possible to retrieve mental activities which aren't encoded or represented as episodic experiential type memories.
Right.
So something which is working at the level of the basal ganglia, this what we call procedural memory, habitual skills. When this happens, I do that. It's not possible to bring to mind why you do that. It's the way in which it's encoded. Whereas in the psychoanalytical tradition, there's this concept of resistance, that there's a sort of a emotional revulsion that keeps the unconscious out of mind because it's so disturbing, so unpleasant. That's a distinguishing point. But that most mental activity is unconscious and that it cannot be brought to mind is common cause. It's just a question then of why is that the case?
Well, I have a wonderful quote from John Killstrom, who's a cognitive scientist and someone I admire, by the way, but he makes a distinction between the Freudian dynamic unconscious, we would say, and the cognitive unconscious, and it is so funny that I have to read it to you. The Freudian unconscious, according to Killstrom, was, quote, hot and wet. It seethed with lust and anger. It was hallucinatory, primitive, and irrational. The unconscious of contemporary psychology is kinder and gentler than that, and more reality-bound and rational. even if it is not entirely cold and dry. Now, the sexual connotations and gendered references in this passage are so obvious that we maybe do not even have to go into them. But I do think that some of the hostility towards the Freudian unconscious is announced in this passage. It's the idea that there's sexual repression in
well, let me just follow up on that, because I mean that's the the thumbnail image that we have of Freud. Why so many people don't like him now is people think he was just sex obsessed. That was everything he cared about. It was just all about sex, and that's what the unconscious was about. Repressed sexual desires.
So I think that's a very important distinction. We've all been agreeing that the notion of an unconscious is not controversial and wasn't even a uniquely Freudian idea. There were precedents going back literally centuries. So I think what was important in Freud's conceptualization of the unconscious was not only the things that I've summarized already, but this point that Siri now brings our attention to, which is that the unconscious for Freud coincided with something else, which he later called the id, which is the instinctual part of the mind. Freud made the not very startling observation that we are a species of animal. So there must also be an instinctual driven, embodied set of mechanisms that are at work in the human mind, no less than in any other species of animal. And interestingly, I think that there's a bit of a contradiction in Freud, because Freud says that the pleasure principle, this affective, seething wetness, that dominates in the id, he speaks of that as being unconscious. Right. But how can a pleasure principle be unconscious? Who's ever spoken of what is an unconscious pleasure?
Right.
Or what's the point of an unconscious pleasure? So the distinction that I'm wanting to introduce is that we have to differentiate between what is cognitively unconscious and what is affectively or emotionally unconscious. Right. So much of what Freud refers to as being unconscious, he means it's unrepresentable in thought. It doesn't mean it isn't consciously felt.
Right.
And I think that we get into lots of muddles on that basis.
Yeah. So let's bring Carl Jung into this.
Yeah.
Jung, of course, was a protege of Freud, came out of the psychoanalytic tradition, then broke away. What's the Jungian idea of the unconscious?
Well, I mean, Jung himself said he was actually never a student of Freud. His teachers were Pierre Janet, Theodore Fournoy, and Eugen Bleuler. And he had his own intellectual formation, and vis-a-vis the unconscious, he was drawing from a German philosophical tradition from Karl Russ and Edward von Hartmann. So there you have a notion that you have an unconscious as primary to consciousness. It's a philosophical conception. And following from that, he has a notion that it is a source of creativity, and in a therapeutic setting is a source of healing and potential self-renewal, and also an aspect that connects one to a wider humanity. But I want to just return back to the question that Mark was saying earlier, that the unconscious is not controversial. I would say it is controversial in many settings in academia and outside, where people say they don't have an unconscious. The question is, are you a monist, or do you allow multiple forms of self-description and ascription? Is one allowed not to have an unconscious if one has other forms of psychological, philosophical, or metaphysical beliefs?
I think you're right. So we have to, I think what Mark and I have been saying here is that in contemporary cognitive science, the idea of an unconscious is no longer controversial. But in many other places, you're absolutely right. If we take in the whole wide world of scholarship, then you certainly have an important point.
So following up on Jung, so just...
I thought he was going to...
No, we agree.
Okay, we agree.
So can you, just so I understand this, can you, the Jung versus the Freud view of the unconscious, can you crystallize that in your understanding?
So, as Mark was indicating, in Freud's late model, it's based on the id. For Jung, the unconscious was not repressed. It wasn't something that was derived in one's own lifetime, but was something that was pre-given. It consisted of structural forms and fantasies that are inborn and present in everyone.
What do you mean pre-given?
That aren't acquired through education, aren't acquired in the course of one's lifetime. So they were akin to Kantian categories. Categories that make thought possible. So you begin to, the typical forms of experience that you meet, you're in a way pre-structured to encounter a world.
And wasn't there an evolutionary aspect to all this for
Yes.
Jung too? That it was so, you can pull that into the story, that, that there were these evolved, if you will, Kantian categories, so to speak. Yeah.
Which in a way was a bit contradictory because he's drawing from different traditions, in a way trying to combine the different philosophical and biological conceptions of the unconscious into a larger synthesis, which was inherently unstable. But nevertheless, there's in therapeutics, the critical aspect was, it was not purely a negative, but also a source of potential renewal.
Yeah, I think Jung was more optimistic than Freud. Lutheran Jew. I mean, there were reasons for this. No, I'm, you know, yes, it's funny, but it's also, I think, true. There was I mean, Freud was a deeply pessimistic about human nature, if you will. And I think Jung was more positive, and they also had very different experiences, very different personalities, right? I mean, Jung had a kind of mystical consciousness. He had that inside him, these experiences. And Freud was a hard-headed scientist in many, many ways.
There's also what Freud called the narcissism of small differences. You know,
yes,
where,
there's also that.
If you look at Jung and Freud and then compare them to everybody else, you know, they're pretty much in the same camp. And you can easily overcome many of these differences if you want to. But I don't think they wanted to.
They didn't want to.
They did not want to, yeah.
Well, let me just throw out one other concept that gets a lot of discussion these days, the collective unconscious. You know, Jung's taking this idea to a whole nother level, I think. Tell us what the collective unconscious is.
It's akin to what the poet W.B. Yeats called the great memory. It's a notion that culture is within. So there's one evocative passage where Jung states in 1912, if all the mythologies and religions were wiped out, they would spontaneously regenerate from within. So that in introspection, in examining one's fantasies, in examining one's dreams, for Jung, that he saw that as a portal or a gateway into, you could say, psychological human history.
Do you think his idea of the collective unconscious was more a religious idea than a scientific idea?
He saw it as both, because he saw it as he saw himself as being a scientist, as an empiricist, and at this point in psychology, on the turn of the century, there is many definitions of what constitutes science in psychology. The fact that they all just call themselves scientists. So in a way, you have to bracket out the term. But to pick up what Siri was saying, that yes, Jung believes there are spiritual factors, and Freud is an atheist, and that is one strict dividing line. That for Jung, the unconscious, as William James put it, is if there be divine revelations, it'll come through the subliminal door. So it's open to transcendence and other dimensions.
And I think it's good to frame this a little bit historically too, and remember that someone like William James was very interested in psychical research. That at that time, this was not regarded as outside of science the way it is now. In fact, a writer that is now today extremely obscure, but someone that I have read and liked, who I think has vanished because he wrote a book called Human Personality and Its Survival of Bodily Death, which you can imagine that scientists are not running after this guy now. But
who is this writer?
It is F.W.H. Myers. He was a good friend of William James. He met George Eliot, and he founded the Psychical Society of Research in the late 19th century. And he was, in fact, a very interesting guy who had an idea about what he called the subliminal self. And this was especially present in, you know, he wrote a lot about genius, that at moments of genius, the subliminal self, which was an unconscious self, and a dynamic presence would emerge. And that is how he explained genius. And it penetrated what we were now calling, you know, the threshold between the unconscious and the conscious.
Well, I mean, isn't one of the fundamental dividing lines between Freud and Jung is Freud was an atheist and Jung was not?
Yeah, but I refer to the narcissism of small differences because I don't think.
Well, I think that's a big difference.
Well,
I
you
do
know, it's
too.
not a big. It's not,
I do too. I think it's a pretty big difference.
I think it's a question that lies outside of science. You know, what one's personal beliefs are. That's why I'm saying these are personal factors between these two personalities. But the idea, let's say, that you were asking about earlier of a collective unconscious. Freud also has a collective unconscious. You know, the Oedipus complex for Freud, these inherited memories of a primal father with his primal pair of scissors cutting off primal penises. You know, this is all remembered by us all. And this also, for Freud, is the source of our mythologies and of our religions. The fact that Freud doesn't believe the religions and Jung does is, you know, kind of, they both of them are Lamarckians. They both believe that we have these inherited memories, which incidentally combines them also to the dustbin of scientific history, because none of us in contemporary cognitive science or affective neuroscience would take seriously these very complicated inherited knowledge bases.
No, but we do think now that, you know, methylation studies and in epigenetics that actually Lamarck was not
well, you can squeeze little details out of it. But, I mean, if you look at the way Jung and Freud speak of this inherited this phylogenetic memories, it's clearly a different story.
No.
But I think that in contemporary neuroscience, what's important to mention here is the instincts. You know, these are we have instinctual predispositions, as I was referring to earlier. This is also something which I think is an important part of the unconscious, although it's affectively conscious. But we have innate knowledge of what to do when you're at a cliff face. You know, you don't jump off to see what happens. You know, you just know that you don't do. So we have fear, we have rage, we have attachment bonding. You know, we have all sorts of instinctual predispositions. And I think that the important thing in relation to the topic of the unconscious, so I think those are that would agree with Jung in the most tenuous of ways, and with Freud, that there are there's an innate tendency, you know, which exists within us all. But I think the important thing in relation to the topic of the unconscious, it goes back to what I was saying earlier, that these things are deeply felt, consciously felt. Rage and fear and lust, you know, are not unconscious. Why does Freud call them unconscious? It's because they're not reflexively, cognitively, they're not tendencies that we own, that we possess in our declarative, you know, self-awareness. And I would go so far as to say that in fact our cognitive apparatus is trying to render these things unconscious. The instinctual life is so strongly felt that it threatens to overwhelm the cognitive the apparatus, and the task of cognitive development is to take sort of ownership of these inclinations and to render them and to dampen them, to make them less wet.
Yes.
But you know, if I just
dry them out.
To dry them out.
But to pick up on Siri's reference of Frederick Myers, who William James thought was really the candidate for the greatest psychologist at that time.
Yes.
He uses the term subliminal consciousness for interesting reasons. He says there is no unconscious per se, because we're not dealing with states that are strictly unconscious.
Right.
We're dealing with different models of what he calls stratified consciousness. And that I think that's an important kind of sense of different models, because if you start talking about forms of the unconscious that are conscious, the language begins to trip up in itself.
Yeah, yeah. Well, no, but I think this idea of a continuum, which is in Myers, but I think actually what Mark is talking about, just to tell you, is that he has turned Freud on his head. You know what I always thought this, Mark, that what Marx did to Hegel, that's what you've done to Freud, essentially, because for Mark, the id is conscious. You can read his paper, very good, but you are turning Freud on his head here.
You're the editor of the new collected works of Sigmund Freud. How dare you?
So that's why he's emphasizing this. Of course, emotions are felt, and I think you're right. Freud knew that we felt things, but there is a problem.
I think the problem arises out of not drawing that distinction between cognitive, representable, thought-type consciousness and affective consciousness. It's an utterly different sort of stuff.
But then there is the unconscious. In other words, right, the stuff we really are not aware of. Not one of us is aware of, how our blood is moving in our body. There are all of that physiological business we're not aware of it. Huh? And then there are, what about those moments when you've forgotten something and it comes. Sometimes now it takes me 2 days to remember a name, but then it arrives. That is clearly a passage from something that was, in that sense, unconscious, not available, not there, into another state. The act of writing is very similar.
So I want to follow up on that, because Siri, you bring a very interesting perspective to this discussion. You are not only very well versed in the history of thinking about this, you were a novelist. Is there a connection between these two things? I mean, does your awareness of psychology and how scientists talk about this, does that make you think any differently about how you write?
No, it probably doesn't, but I do think that the experience of writing, and perhaps most particularly writing fiction, is interesting in relation to the unconscious, because at a certain point in a book, the book seems to be writing itself. Now, what the heck is that, right? That is something peculiar. You don't know where the sentences are coming from. I always say this, why one story and not another? Why does it have to be one way and not another? Why does a writer choose?
Why?
Exactly.
You're here to explain it, right?
So part of that is an effective, I think, what Mark was talking about before, that the only way an artist can know what's right or wrong is a gut feeling, something that when you look at the sentence, you say, that's it. Or you know that a character has to die, sometimes sadly.
And you're saying this is coming out of the unconscious. I mean, that feeling.
I would say I always feel that the book is already written, and that it's like remembering something that never happened. So you're trying to drag out unconscious memories from this place. I know but I'm not alone in feeling this.
But in speaking of writing in memory as recollection, this
Right.
takes one back to Plato.
Yes.
And those
Yes.
are the classic descriptions of memory that
Yes.
people are now recycling in terms of the unconscious. But Plato got by quite well without speaking of the unconscious or speaking about consciousness, and set the models by which we still debate these terms. So in a way, I'd like to say, again, historically people got by with well over a century in the West and longer elsewhere without having to cast things in terms of a notion of the unconscious.
It's true, but
Shakespeare doesn't use it, and I think that
No.
there's not much in human conduct that's missing from Shakespeare.
no, it's true, except that with Plato, you bring up Plato, Aristotelian thinking, the mind-body, soul-body distinction goes on and on and on. And just to bring a little feminist moment to this discussion, is that the body was, of course, always associated with the female. It was always lower. In Pauline Christianity, this became even more dramatic, right? A Neoplatonic idea. And the mind was masculine and clean and dry. and elevated. So, you know, we drag our traditions with us, and they aren't always full of wondrous things for everybody in the population.
So to bring science, and specifically neuroscience, back into the discussion, isn't creativity, isn't what you do as a novelist a total mystery? I mean, the question is, will neuroscience ever be able to explain why, when you're at your writing desk, that particular storyline pops into your head?
Listen, I'm interested in science enough to think that that one of the problems with studying creativity and contemporary neuroscience is that the definition, again, is pretty bad. So the definition is this. Creativity in contemporary neuroscience is something novel, okay, new, something new. And the other part of it is that it's useful. Now, I ask you whether Emily Dickinson's poems were useful, whether my novels, are they useful, and what would that use be? This seems to be a peculiar definition. It's a kind of corporate definition, right? We want our workers to be really creative and to create useful things that will make us a lot of money. So that's a problem. And the other thing is divergent thinking, that people who can make distant associations, they are creative. I think that's true sometimes, and other times it's probably not true.
So I want to come back to this question about neuroscience.
So sometimes I think, however, you know, there are interesting questions to be asked that brain studies might be able to answer.
For instance?
For example, I think connectivity in the brain. What is being harnessed at those moments when people are in the so-called zone? I think that would be interesting.
Mark, you are our resident neurobiologist on the panel here. What's your take on this?
Well, first of all, I agree, not only in regard to creativity, but a lot else in the life of the mind. You know, in cognitive neuroscience, we have very denuded conceptualizations of these things, and I think that we're slowly getting better at it. Yeah. So, you know, as our understanding of what the hell creativity is improves, you know, as we're sort of brave enough to encompass properly what we mean by creativity, I think that we will get a better grasp on it. The place I look to for sort of beginnings of an understanding or beginnings of some ideas that might be useful is brain mechanisms of dreaming. I think that the dipping into an altered state of a different way of thinking and an ability to bring that back into the rational waking world has some important analogies with what creativity in the fuller sense of the word is all about. Now in the dreaming brain, the prefrontal cortex, the sort of rational, goal-directed, logical, reality-oriented executive of the mind, it is massively deactivated. And that instinctual emotional part that I spoke of earlier, the limbic structures, they switched on like a Christmas tree. And then as you come out of dreaming sleep, so that the frontal lobes come back online, and then there's an inhibition and a removal from consciousness, a forgetting of the dream. I think that creative people have a more, you know, they retain the dream, as it were, a little bit longer. They're able to dip into it without them living in a dream. They don't cut themselves off from it entirely. So I think it's something to do with prefrontal cortex allowing the limbic ways of functioning in a little bit more, and then grabbing hold of it and turning it to, dare I say, useful effect.
Right, so useful. But also, I mean, Jung was very interested in these processes and had some psychotic experiences himself, right?
I wouldn't say he had. I wouldn't say
hallucinatory.
he had psychotic experiences. I would say he had. His main work was to do with the exploration of hypnagogic visions in a waking state, which is something quite specific.
By the way, there's no prejudice here. Yeah. I have had hallucinations, and I have hypnagogia every single night. So
that's the stuff he was trying to explore.
Well, in fact, can you, because Jung came up with this phrase that he used that was part of his way, as I understand it, of accessing the unconscious is what he called active imagination. Can you explain what he meant by that?
Just to pick up again on Siri's reference to Frederick Myers, for Frederick Myers, a genius or someone creative was someone who had the subliminal on tap. So the question posed then was, how do you access, if it's the source of creativity as well as pathology, how do you access those resources? So for Jung, in around 1913-14, he'd been practicing analysis for quite a while then. In fact, dream analysis wasn't sufficient. There needed to be another way of accessing these materials in a waking state. People at that time were using things like automatic writing, crystal gazing, to try to foster image making. And so what he would do was to enter into fantasies, provoke fantasies in a waking state, and enter into dialogue with the characters that emerged. And in a way, this is not too far removed from what a novelist does or a playwright in terms of creating characters.
So I'm just trying to imagine this. So is he kind of semi-awake? Is he fully awake? Is he what's sort of the state of consciousness when he's doing this? He's
awake, entering into a state of concentration and allowing images to emerge. And then entering into dialoguing with the characters that emerged, and then sometimes then painting and drawing, and allowing these images to say something back to him, not trying to immediately interpret them.
Right.
That sounds a little like writing a novel.
Well,
it?
I think, first of all, this is like just the lowdown. You cannot write a novel unless you are in a state of real relaxation, which doesn't mean you aren't concentrated, but your body you have to be completely open and loose. And that's very much what you're talking about with Jung. And often at night before I go to sleep and I'm having my hypnagogic images, and I will hear, my characters talking, not actually outside, but they'll just be talking to me inside. It won't necessarily appear on the page. But that's a kind of, it's an openness to whatever is happening.
You're talking about, techniques to access the unconscious. Sort of getting yourself almost into a bit of an altered state of mind to tap this other part of you that normally we don't have access to.
I think many writers actually do. And painters and musicians.
And the psychologist Pierre Janet would use this in psychotherapy as a form of distraction. You distract yourself to allow another aspect to function freely in a more imaginative way.
So, Mark, what are some effective techniques you've come across to, if we want to gain more access to our unconscious, because it could be a source of nourishment or of creativity?
Well, I must confess I don't have any special expertise in terms of enhancing creativity, but in terms of gaining access to the unconscious, the standard method in psychoanalysis, which you can see parallels with what else has been said now, is the free association method, which is a giving up of deliberate, controlled sort of a channeling of thought processes and just allowing one's thoughts to emerge. And then trying to report them as fully and with as little censorship as possible. That is the standards, the sort of fundamental technique of psychoanalysis, and it's meant to. Yes, of course. It's meant to. You can see how, in relation to what I was saying earlier, the sort of prefrontal lobes, or this focused attention is given up, and then these more implicit mechanisms come to the fore. But and this is where the link is with creativity. It's not just giving free rein. There's a sort of a coming and going. There's an observing ego that notices what you're saying and then makes use of it. So it's not just rambling. It's rambling and then noticing the structure of one's rambles, and then rambling and then noticing, there's a pattern to this. Or one's analyst notices that pattern. And with dreams, which are another, the analysis of dreams is another sort of standard classical psychoanalytical technique of gaining access to the unconscious. It's just a specialized form of the same thing, except here you're free associating in relation to the dream. So you report the dream, and then you say everything that comes to mind in relation to the dream, and why that is uniquely productive of insight into what is normally unconscious is because the dream itself is generated without the prefrontal lobes being, part of the story. So you already have something that's pretty unalloyed, instinctual, id-like limbic system sort of functions. And then you free associate in relation to that, so you're going to get even deeper access. So normally you don't, in waking life, you don't have a conscious form of these id-like thoughts, but in the dream you do, because the prefrontal lobes are offline during sleep.
Yeah, and I think that psychoanalysis broadens the spectrum to non-artists, so to speak. And one of my favorite quotes is from Einstein. He was asked by Jacques Hadamard how he worked. And Einstein, this is summarizing, but he said that his real work was visual, muscular, and emotional. And that's where he did the real work. And then, logical science, linguistic or mathematical came later. I think actually that's a very deep insight into creativity, that what we are looking at are very deep motor, visual, pre-linguistic parts of us that are activated.
Now, there's another piece of the unconscious that those with more of a spiritual inclination would look to, that this would seem to be where those moments of transcendence come from, when you see the world in a different way in some way. And I know this is one thing that Jung talked about, for instance, and I'm assuming that a lot of what we would call religious experience comes out of the unconscious. Fair to say?
Well, that was the model first put forward by Theodore Flournoy and William James, the notion that it's precisely within those states where there is access to another dimension, in all likelihood. And Jung followed on in that way. But again, you find in Jung's own personal writings, in his black books, in his red book, he doesn't use the term unconscious.
He never uses that word at all.
Not in those texts. He uses the word fantasy and he uses the word symbol. He doesn't need that term. For him, it was an attempt to translate his conceptions and insights in his public writings into a language acceptable to a medical and scientific audience.
Oh, so that's interesting. So symbol was a more acceptable word than the unconscious for scientists?
Well, no, he felt the unconscious was a more acceptable term.
Okay.
In terms of to try to translate his terms in a form acceptable to a medical and scientific audience. So, and in that sense, it's a way of like trying to validate certain experiences, to sort of say, look, these experiences are not out of the human. They are legitimate, and there are ways to try to facilitate those.
So I'd like to introduce something else from the cognitive neuroscience perspective, which I think relates to some of the questions that we've been discussing, which is that there is a great pressure to automatize. Our conscious cognitive capacity is exceedingly limited. The reason that telephone numbers are 7 digits long is because that's the extent of conscious cognitive capacity. We're able to hold in mind 7 bits of information consciously at any one point of time. And you think of how much information your mind consists in, and then compare that to the number 7, you get some sort of sense of just how small. So it's an extremely limited and therefore precious resource. It has to be used sparingly. That's why there's a pressure to chunk things out of consciousness as rapidly as possible, so that you use consciousness only to the extent that you really have to. So as we've learned how things work, as we've mastered things, as we sort of solve problems, they become automatized, the solutions. When I'm facing this problem, that's what I do. I don't even realize that that's what I'm doing. Now, what that means is that our deepest knowledge, the sort of deepest pattern of how things work, is paradoxically less available to consciousness, so that we're dealing with all of these sort of concrete details consciously, and our wisdom, as it were, has been chunked down. We'd speak of systems consolidation in neuroscience. It goes down to deeper brain systems until ultimately, if you get to the level of basal ganglia, as I was saying earlier, it's no longer representable. So, you have deep understanding of what to do in the world and how the world works, but that understanding is not declarative understanding that you... So I think that both in regard to creativity and in regard to spirituality, there's something of these unique individuals or with altered states with the help of substances, you gain access to this normally unconscious modes of cognition where affect also is strongly dominates, and bring them to the surface. And so there's profound wisdom, profound sort of revelation of the deep structure of things which we value in the work of artists and of visionaries.
One thing I'm curious about for all of you is, I mean, you've all spent years studying these things. I mean, you're deeply well versed in the history of these ideas about the unconscious, about the mind. Given all of that, has that changed anything about what you do in your own lives to have a more rewarding life? I mean, if you want to tap your own unconscious to have a more fulfilling life, has it made any difference?
Who's going first?
I don't know. It's like someone once asked me, because we actually haven't talked about, but I've been deeply, profoundly interested in child development and growing. And someone said, "So when you had your daughter, did this affect the way you treated your child?" And I said, "Well, I don't really think so. A lot of what we do is intuitive. It's what you were saying that." Does what I know about the unconscious or the mind-body problem, the insoluble mind-body problem, has that affected my work as a writer?
I think the answer is no, is what you're saying.
No, not really.
So I think in my case, it's been... I could say many things, but just sort of the essence of it is that I have greater skepticism or perhaps humility is the word for it in relation to what can I know? To what extent can I really solve this? To what extent should I even try to be on top of this? So it's sort of giving myself over a little bit more to intuition, not that means that anything goes, but recognizing that there are things that I've learned that I don't even know what they are, and I sort of am willing to hand over control, but also, which is a slightly different aspect of the same thing, that there's a humility as to what one can understand. I don't value thinking and logic and empiricism as highly as I did when I was a young man. The limits of knowledge, the limits of what one can understand, is sort of giving oneself over also in that sense. The limits of science. It's not the beginning and end of everything. It's a very valuable thing, but it's not everything.
Sonu?
When I read Jung and Freud in my teens, I acquired an unconscious. And, the more I began to study it historically, I decided to opt out of the unconscious. So I think I had one for about a decade. And not to say that I think it's not a valid notion if one wants to have one. It is a valid way of conceiving of one's life and the life of others as a hermeneutic, as a narrative, even as a therapeutic. But to me, I just prefer to travel light. More problems associated with it than
you need.
No. We spent a lot of time talking about Freud and Jung, and of course they came up with their theories a century ago or so. Do we need a new model of the unconscious in today's world, given all that we know about science?
There is a new model. I mean, in some way, I think that Freud and Jung are I mean, there's neuropsychoanalysis. We know each other because we've been involved in that. Mark got me involved. But no, there is a new model. I think the problem is that the model is impoverished. And one of the reasons it's impoverished, the cognitive unconscious, is because the history of the unconscious has been ignored.
Wait, so what's the new model that you're saying is impoverished?
The cognitive unconscious, it's everywhere. You can look it up. Killstrom is one, but there are many people defining it all the time. And as that quote I read, it's reality bound, and it's more reality bound and rational, and even though it's not quite cold and dry. It's
but your question as to is a new model required, I think, well, I heard it in a different way from how Siri did. I think that the cognitive neuroscience model of the unconscious is hardly new anymore. You know, it's been around for decades. I think what's needed is a model which can accommodate both what the psychoanalytical tradition encompassed under the term unconscious, and what we've since learned. Because you know, let us not forget that cognitive neuroscience has added something. You know, for heaven's sake, we've learned some new things about how the mind works. But you know, as you heard from the slightly comical quote that Siri read us, you know, it's almost deliberately excludes so much else that clearly needs to be accommodated. So I think if we need a new model, it's a model that can reconcile both the affective, instinctual, and the more sort of troubling unconscious of Freud, and everything that we've learned about how the brain mechanisms of how conscious mental processes become unconscious. And I would even like to indicate the direction forwards. The essential idea in the cognitive unconscious is that when a problem's solved, it is automatized. And I've said already why there's great pressure to do that. In the Freudian unconscious, one never talks of automatizing things. Rather, they're these irrational, repeatedly doing things which are not in your own best interest and not knowing why. And I think that the link between the two is this. In the cognitive unconscious, we speak of we automatize problems once they're solved, but we don't make any reference to the fact that many problems in life are insoluble. You know, and so what do you do with those? You're a little kid. You know, I'm Mark Solms. I'm 4 years old, and you know there are things that problems I really want to solve. Like I want to be big like Daddy. You know, I want to be the boss of everything. I want to be driving car. I want to make babies. I want to make babies with her. You know, and I want to do it now. And you know, but you don't have the foggiest clue how to make babies, and you don't. You know, there's no way that you can take the place of your father. So you have two choices. Either you carry on thinking about this to the exclusion of learning that 2 + 2 is 4 and how to tie your shoelaces, because you only got 7 bits of information that you can concentrate on. You know, or you say, okay, I think it works like this. This is how I'm going to do it. That works, even though it doesn't. And you automatize non-solutions. You automatize childish ways of trying to solve the thing, and then you put it out of mind. You sort of cut your losses. And I think that the unconscious, the cognitive unconscious, includes also these things: automatized, prematurely automatized or illegitimately automatized childish solutions, which are now rendered automatic and unconscious, and they're not subject to updating. I think that that's the beginnings of a reconciliation of the two models.
I think when you ask, does one need a new model, it sounds like, you know, have you upgraded yet? Are you still on Windows 8 or an iPhone 5 or something? And, you know, are you missing some drives or certain levers to function better?
Well, but in science, models are important, to be fair, right?
True,
if you're going to do hard science in that way, hard science, you need some frame. And the model is not the world, right? The model is just something that you work with that's getting better than your old, lousier model.
Okay, but I think one needs to move then out of conceptual debate and say, well, how do these models function in society?
Yeah.
Do people with different models, quote unquote, of the unconscious, are they happier? Or do they actually have more self-knowledge? Can you actually tell, oh, he's got an unconscious or she's got an unconscious, or there's someone with a Jungian unconscious or an Adlerian or something? But I mean this quite seriously in terms of an ethnography of how the unconscious is then lived and embodied by different social groups. Where do more people have an unconscious? Is it presumably in the big metropoles, in London, in New York, even in certain suburbs in these cities? How do they interface with people who don't have one?
Well, okay, let me turn that around a little bit then. So, I mean, really what you're saying is the proof is in the pudding, and let's look for where people are happier, where people have fuller, richer lives.
There's a utilitarian aspect to this, but I think what he's saying is something, I mean, I think we have important philosophical differences that are represented here. I'm not exactly sure where I'm going to situate myself, but the idea, what you are talking about, is essentially the idea that the unconscious is something that was created in various places over time, and that it's a construct, a cultural or societal construct, that then works in the world as such. So that for you, the idea that there is some empirical, if you will, some kind of out there, unconscious, is simply either not interesting or not true.
You see, I think that
he has to answer. You can't start talking until he says something. Sorry.
Yes, that's my position. In the way that, as Wittgenstein put it, meaning is use. So the unconscious is not simply how it's defined conceptually, although that's a critical part of it. But let's look, we now have a century of looking, well, how did people take up this notion? How is it embodied in institutions? What work does it do in society? So let's try to look at it in a way an anthropologist would do.
Sure, that's very anthropological.
Mark?
So I think that scientific constructs are cultural constructs, but they're jolly good ones. Because we are self-consciously trying to accommodate all the observed facts. So if we have a construct which leaves out some of the facts, there's something the matter with our construct, so we upgrade it, not because we want in the cultural sense that you're referring to, but because there's clearly something that needs to be improved here. So in relation to our constructs of the unconscious, I was saying we have facts which are accounted for by cognitive neuroscience, which were not accounted for by psychoanalysis, and vice versa. So what we need is a construct which can accommodate all these facts. The definition of the cognitive unconscious that Siri read at the beginning about a kindler, gentler, nicer sort of unconscious is just not true. I mean, look at the way that we behave. So I think that we need a construct of how it works which takes account of our more primitive inclinations. And I think that that's very important if we can have an understanding of the human condition which is not so self-deluding.
Right. So just to get in one last thing, I mean, it's very interesting to be sitting to these 2 points of view. But also, one of the problems with the cognitive unconscious is that cognitive science that became, huge in the 50s, coming out of Turing, right? Coming out of binary neurons and Pitts-McCulloch. This has a hidden Cartesian side to it. It is hiding its dualistic mind-body problem, and neuroscience has not addressed this well enough. There's a move to embodied positions. That's getting hotter and hotter, and there are many, many different versions of that. But that is one of the big problems with the so-called cognitive unconscious. And they couldn't fit emotion in very well, so that became a big problem.
Yeah.
Yes, because it's a problem-solving machine.
But just as a writer to that, I spent a lot of time working and writing on the history of concepts of the unconscious, and then I suddenly had an idea that struck me. Well, it was fairly dumb that I'd not thought about this before, but that the more I came to see it, the unconscious was, in a way, a small story within a larger history of consciousness, in which paradoxically there's an awful lot less work done at a historical level. The main issue is dualism.
Right.
That is the more fundamental problem.
That is the fundamental
So whether you have an unconscious or semi-unconscious or a stratified consciousness is a secondary problem to dualism.
Absolutely.
We could keep going on here, but I want to make sure that our audience has a chance to weigh in with their questions, their comments, and so we have a couple of roving mics here, and if you want to raise your hands.
Well, you seem to be asking about two diametrically opposite things, I think deliberately so. So starting with the LSD and psilocybin and so on, these are drugs which act on cortex, that is on the cognitive part of the brain, and they are undoing their normal modes of operating. So, it is, I think, revelatory of more normally inhibited modes of cognition and affectivity. I think that exactly the same as the other historical traditions that you refer to, altered states of consciousness have been valued in a great many different cultural traditions precisely because it gives us access to these deeper strata of the mind, the deeper modes of functioning of the mind, which are terribly important because they actually govern what we do, they govern what we know, and we don't normally have access to them. As to the other part of your question about is it possible to shut consciousness off completely, and you refer to your experience under general anesthesia, I want to tell you that there are many different modes of action of general anesthetics. They don't all do the same thing in the brain. And what's frightening for those of us who every now and then have to have a general anesthetic is we don't understand that much about exactly what's going on in the brain with general anesthesia. There's a lot of advances in recent times, in current times, in terms of our understanding at the cellular level and at the systems level. But it's a rapidly evolving field. We're catching up with our understanding of what these drugs do.
Are you saying that we should be worried?
I think
okay.
so. There's some of the more interesting work, I think. The more interesting papers are connected to research in creativity and schizophrenia, creativity in people who absolutely have brain injuries, some Alzheimer's patients, and even people who have, Mark, I'm sure has stories like this too, people who were not creative before, right? So, and suddenly they have either urges to write poetry or to draw. They acquire a facility for drawing. So this suggests brain changes, even brain injury at times that alters. There's a woman named Alice Flaherty that she's a neurologist, and I saw her not long ago in Boston. Do you remember she spoke at the neuropsychoanalysis? She had experiences after giving birth of needing to write. And it was actually, her book is called The Midnight Disease. It's very interesting. But her urges to write go in kind of manic periods, and they followed the births of her children.
I love the fact that you've brought wisdom into the discussion here. So how does that fit in our discussion?
Well, it all hangs on, you're saying the highest level. It's depends how you want to see
Exactly.
the hierarchy. I would have thought, well, the image that was forming in my mind as you were iterating these patterns of patterns of patterns was that the deepest patterns, in other words, the lowest ones, contain the most concentrated knowledge, as it were. But whether the word, so the surface is dealing with the here and now, and what you've learned before it is chunked down. And importantly, I've used the word twice already, and I want to use it again. Eventually, it's no longer cortical. It becomes subcortical. It becomes basal ganglia, and these thoughts can no longer be brought. They can no longer be declared. They're no longer representable. So, these deeply automatized modes of operating in the world, just knowing what to do, which we call intuition, I don't know if that's the, so those are the deepest patterns. I don't know if that's wisdom. You know, I think that wisdom requires something more along the lines of what we were talking about earlier in relation to creativity. It's something to do with the capacity to be able to bring these deeper structures back to declarative awareness. I think that it's not being a zombie is not being wise. You know, so being able to declare the patterns, to bring them to light, to be able to share, to make us self-aware of what it is that we're doing. I think that that's something very valuable, and it's not.
And you said something very important in the beginning, which is about a child learning. Children learn through other people. You know, one thing about the Western tradition that drives me crazy is the idea of the autonomous man, right? You really can't have a brain without another brain. You know, an infant's brain, you know, you can't. We human beings are neotenous, right? We develop very, very slowly, much more slowly than most other mammals. And if you leave an infant out, that's it. We need others, and we develop very slowly through those others, which might very well explain something about our capacities, our reflective capacities.
And being aware of that is wisdom.
And being aware of that is wisdom, and being aware of our needs and dependence on other people, which is something that is often very foreign to scientific traditions that look at the brain as if it's some isolated organ, not in relation to the rest of the body and not in relation to other people. I think this is a corrective that is certainly coming, but it's very important to remember.
I'm struck by that, by the terms of the debate of what a colleague of mine, Fernando Vidal, calls brainhood. Mm-hmm. We are in an era, that he argues, where we now have the cerebral subject, where traditional forms of understanding are being reclassified in a neuro-language. So the simple question of wisdom, which for Socrates was quite simply answered with knowing that you don't know, is now being, and I'm not criticizing it, but redefined in neural terms. So in a way, you have a reclassification of Western thought, but guess what? Much of the language remains exactly the same, but
yes,
with an N prefix in front of it.
Yeah.
So to me, this whole this intellectual and social formation needs to be studied from the outside as well as developed from within.
I totally agree.
I'll say something for starters. I think that, I'll say two things. I think that we overestimate the impact of these things. You know, 100 years ago, we were terrified, or a little more than 100 years ago, you know, about the impact of the speed of railway carriages, and you know, what will this do to our brains? And you know, we're not designed for these speeds, and there were whole new disorders, railway spine, and
yes,
so on. You know,
I love railway spine.
And you know, guess what? We seem, the next generation seem to manage it perfectly well. So the capacity for adaptation of thalamocortical structures, if you'll forgive me neurologizing everything, is enormous, you know, and it freaks you out, but it doesn't freak your daughter out. On the other hand, being an old dog myself, I am concerned about the loss of embodiment, you know, that there are many things that our brains are designed to do, precisely as Siri was saying a moment ago, not only in relation to our own physical bodies, but also in relation to other bodies. You know, to take one example, rough and tumble play. There are brain mechanisms for play, and it has everything to do with well, our understanding of why play is so important for mammals is that it's everything to do with working out some sort of social structure that's okay for both of you or for all three of you. Working out the rules of the game. What can I get away with? What can't I get away with? If I push too far, then you know they won't play anymore. So I have to take account of their. This sort of physical play is terribly important for society. Playing games against a computer where there's no other being there and where there's no actual seeing what the effects of your actions are, I think that there is something lost there.
What I'm struck by is if you for example, if you go and read the Freud-Jung correspondence, it's a great correspondence, but you find these are individuals that are able to write like a 10-page theoretical letter of a new theory they've not developed before. They've not kept a carbon copy. They've not pressed save. They've sent it off. In 3 weeks' time, they're able to exactly follow on and not miss a beat. So that memory capacity now, to my mind, as far as I see, is not what it was then. I see that also in my own life, starting out from pre-computer days to now. So that when we speak about localizing consciousness or functions such as memory in the brain, I think it's important also to bear in mind memory is not a constant at a historical level. We adapt, we offload to technological prosthetic devices. We change in very interesting ways.
So the question is, are we losing anything in that process? Because obviously with our devices, the capacity for memory is much greater than it used to be.
It shifts, so that to me, one almost becomes like a librarian. One has to know where to find things one has put rather than to retain things in memory. We're not dealing with a culture that memorized verse and built up great mnemonic capacities.
No, but this is Plato again. We keep going back to Plato, but that's exactly, he was worried about writing and losing the oral gifts of memory. So we keep changing and we keep staying the same. Well, since everyone in the world probably doesn't have high school, but you mean some version of that.
Oh,
No,
I'll wait till I have it before.
I have not had that dream that I'm aware of. So.
No, there have been empirical studies of this going back to the 1950s. And I mention that because we've now got an expanse of 60-odd years to see, have these dreams changed over a period when societies have changed very rapidly. And also, it's not just a matter of time, it's also geographical spread. These studies were done all over the world. And it's really quite remarkable how there are indeed typical dreams, like the dream of being inappropriately clad in a public place. The dream of being on a stage and having to deliver something and being unprepared for it. The dream of having to re-sit an examination that one thought one had passed long ago, and so on. There's a series of these dreams which are remarkably uniform across human cultures and across decades of time. Yeah, the broken teeth, something too big in your mouth, etc. There are quite a few of them. But there, I have to say that I think our understanding of where these dreams come from doesn't begin to do justice to the profoundly striking fact that these dreams exist. I'll just say one thing, which is at least they show that dreams can't be random froth. It can't be meaningless junk. The fact that we have these structured forms of dreams throughout human societies over 60 years says that there must be some mental, these are thought processes. They have the dignity of actual cognitions. But beyond that, I don't think we understand where those dreams come from. I'll say one other thing, though, since that not about dreams, but there's a thing called REM behavior disorder, which comes with certain Parkinsonian diseases, and you can artificially create it in animals, not me, my colleagues, by lesioning a part of the midbrain. And then the animal acts out its dreams, and us humans with those diseases, we act out our dreams. And there too, there's a remarkable uniformity. But the striking thing is that in the behavior that we see with REM behavior disorder and in these lesioned animals are instinctual behaviors. You see stalking and pouncing and copulating and whatnot. You don't see yourself writing your exam.
I think it's, as Mark was saying, there's a lot of brain research that's going forward, but I do think it's important to frame this with a truth, which is there is no consensus for a working model of the mind yet. There really isn't. There are many different ideas, and when you were talking about essentially locationist ideas, right? We read that in the paper all the time. There's a part of the brain for this and a part of a brain for that. Locationist theories have been around since the Greeks, and they carry some of the truth, but they don't carry all of the truth, right? Because so many brain regions are involved in so many functions or processes that it's just important to acknowledge that this is an ongoing project and so much is just not known. As for Buddhism, as you probably know, there's a lot of communication now between people doing brain research and Buddhist monks, for example. So this is a kind of friendship thing, I mean, that's been going on for years because people who have such tremendous meditation skills are really fascinating to scientists, right?
I think that the two aspects that I'd like to pick up on in your question. The first is, I mean, you're entirely right. There are traditions of transformative practices that in terms of the control of body in Buddhism and yoga and so forth, that are quite radically different from practices in the West that deserve further study. But I think there's a note of caution, and it's sounded by, there's a great Tibet scholar called Donald Lopez, wrote a book called The Scientific Buddha, His Short and Happy Life. And it's about modes in which Buddhism has been reinvented to act as if, in terms of this so-called marriage between Buddhism and the sciences, and to pick up on one aspect, in terms of mindfulness, as Lopez has shown, if you go and read these texts from which this term is derived, they involve practices such as going to cemeteries and imagining oneself as a corpse. These practices were actually designed to increase stress. They were not designed to decrease stress. They were designed to increase stress so that one realizes the impermanence and broke free of one's actual state. Right. And so even the term mindfulness, I mean, there's no concept of mind in Buddhism, so how can you be mindful? I think it's a particularly gruesome translation, and Mark knows something about gruesome translations and their effects on thought. Yeah.
We have more questions. We have no more time. You have been a wonderful audience. Thank you so much. Thank you to our guests.